Hi, my name's Tyler Moore, and today I'm going to be presenting to you the smartest guys in the room. And today I'm going to be presenting to you the smartest guys in the room, The Rise and Fall of Enron. It's by Bethany McLean and Peter Elkind. So I think most of us by now know the story of Enron. This book really does get into the details of the financial rise and fall and the accounting scandals that took place. So I guess to give a high-level understanding first of really what the company was and the reason why they fell was it was led by greed and arrogance. It was the utmost confidence and really the greed from Enron's upper leadership to be absolutely obsessed with the stock price and the value of the firm. And it led to them being a overvalued company in a bull market of the 1990s, or rather the late 1990s. And because it was all not real, it led to the ultimate fall of Enron. So let's first start out with the perpetrators or the characters of this scandal. So let's first start out with Ken Lay. So Ken Lay was the founder and CEO of Enron. He started the company in the 80s. He came out from Washington as a lobbyist for this vision he had of a company he wanted to create in energy. And so he was from the company from the start all the way to the end to his sentencing to prison for his scandals. And next you have Jeff Skilling. Jeff Skilling was the president and COO of Enron. He was the visionary of where he wanted the company to go. And next you have Andy Fastow. He is the CFO and the architect and orchestrator of all of the financial vehicles and moving the debt and really cooking the books for Enron. Next you have Rebecca Mark, who was the CEO of Enron International. And she played a big role in the early 1990s of Enron, of a different path maybe they could have taken. Next, you have Cliff Baxter. And Cliff Baxter was inside of Jeff Skilling's inner circle and worked under him as the chief deal maker for these large Enron contracts that were being written up and being traded around. Next, you have Tim Belden. Tim Belden was a West Coast power trader, and he was the architect of the California electricity fraud. Next, you have Rick Cossey. Rick Cossey was a CAO, or the chief accounting officer of Enron, and signed off on all of the scandals and all these fraudulent accounting structures and financial models being built to cook the books for Enron. Next, you have Lou Pai, and like Baxter, he was inside of Skilling's inner circle. And then Pai worked very closely with the traders, rather in the trading division of Enron, the early days of Enron. And he later became the CEO of Enron Energy Services, which was essentially just the traders. Next, you have Ken Rice, who was also under Skilling's inner circle. And he too was a trader, and he later became the CEO of Enron Broadband Services. And next we have Sharon Watkins. Sharon Watkins is known as the internal whistleblower within Enron and was a Enron accountant and was a big part of the ultimate fall of the company. And then next you have Tim Duncan. And Tim Duncan was an Arthur Andersen audit partner, and Arthur Andersen was the external auditor for Enron. And so he worked closely with Lay and Skilling to lead the engagement team and signed off on all of these different financial schemes that allowed Enron to show these great earnings reports. So before we get into the details of what happened within the book and within the Enron scandal, I want to first show you a advertisement. I think it really shows the mantra of what Enron was and what they believed in as far as their company structure and their company culture. So I'll go ahead and show it to you.
Why? It is a small word, but it is a quick, sharp, and abrupt word.
Why?
It is the chosen word of the nonconformist, the defiant, and the visionary. It is a confrontational word.
Why?
It challenges what's thought to be impossible. If you are not afraid to ask why, you can change whatever it is you want.
So as you can see from that advertisement, Enron's mantra was to ask why. They were innovators in their industry, and they wanted to ask why anything was. They wanted to be the leading edge, the cutting edge of their industry. And so it ends up being ironic in the end of their motto was to ask why. And so I want to first start out with Enron's 1998 annual report of their core values. And so it's around 4 pillars. It's based around respect, integrity, communication, and excellence. So if you were to put them together, the first 3 of respect, integrity, and communication, and it's really around all 3 of those to their stakeholders, is to respect their stakeholders, to have integrity, to be honest with them, and to communicate their strategies and their financial reporting as to what they're doing, and which clearly they were doing none of which, but they actually were hitting on their 4th pillar of excellence, and that they wanted to be the best at everything they did. And they really did strive for that. That was their business strategy. But the issue was that they had to jump through a lot of loopholes and a lot of hoops, essentially, to hit that excellence pillar. And it brought down the other 3 pillars. It really sacrificed those to reach that excellence status quo that they wanted it to be. So let's first start out with Ken Lay, the founder of Enron. So Ken Lay grew up in a small farming town in Missouri. He was the son of a preacher man. And he went to Mizzou where he studied economics. And there he realized that he had this idea of he wanted to go into commodity trading and the energy business. But he felt it could be most successful if it was deregulated. And so what that means is normally the government will cap prices, a floor and a ceiling, as to what commodity prices should be. And so he went to Washington and he lobbied hard for the deregulation of a commodity industry. And so what ended up being deregulated was the oil industry, or rather the energy in general. And so while doing that, he was able to develop a close tie with the Bush family, specifically George H.W. Bush. And within that relationship, it really paid dividends further down the road. But regardless of fact, he became really like a politician that was a CEO of a company. And so from there, the company took off. The energy sector and the industry was deregulated. And so he acquired a Houston energy company that had been around for a long time. He acquired a pipeline pipeline company in Omaha and started really what was the foundation of Enron. And so they're going through and they started the trading business. And it was really developing to what Enron wanted to become in the long run. And so one of the sectors of that was, as it sounds, of they were traders. And so they actually had a trading desk in Valhalla, New York. And this actually led to the Enron oil trading scandal in the 1980s that really could have been the fault of Enron at the time. And what was happening was these traders, unbeknownst to Lay, were embezzling all of Enron's money and gambling it all on the market, and they continued to hit profits. They're making millions and millions of dollars, and it was creating a lot of value for Ken Lay. And so in Ken Lay's fashion, he just turned his head the other way because these traders were making him a ton of money. Well, what they were doing is they were embezzling all this money, making huge profits, and they were pocketing some of these profits and moving to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and such. And they did a good job hiding it because the investigators were not able to trace it all the way back, but they were actually ended up being found guilty of fraud and embezzlement. But they gambled so much of the money away, it actually almost drove Enron bankrupt in the 1980s, to where an accountant had to fly up to these traders in New York and force them to show them the real books, what was going on. And this executive or accountant was able to somehow salvage the books and portray it in a way that the company did not have to file for bankruptcy. And of course, Ken Lay, when finding out that these traders were embezzling all of his company's money, was just astonished that they were even doing this. And he, of course, was found not guilty of anything, considering that he played off that he was the victim of all this. Even though he was making a lot of money, he was really just turning his head the other way. And it's really an early sign of Ken Lay's leadership of all he cared about was making money and seeing company growth. He didn't care what it took for it to happen. And so this really translates and was the first sign of a red flag of Ken Lay's leadership and what Enron was to be down the road. And so since this trader who was making all the money for Enron at the time was now behind bars, they needed a new leader. And so in came the visionary of Jeff Skilling. So Just Skilling was, he was a genius. He was a very, very smart man. But the one issue that he had, or the flaw they had, was people described him as being arrogant and very difficult to work with. So he started his career at McKinsey & Company, a very, very high-end, very expensive consulting firm in which he was a consultant actually for Enron. And so Lay saw this, and he knew they needed a new visionary, a new way of making money and profits for Enron. So he hired from the consulting company and hired Skilling to run the trading floor for Enron. And so when Skilling came, he saw this as an opportunity, kind of like as Lay saw it, was this is a great opportunity for Enron to be pretty much the New York Stock Exchange of commodity trading and natural gas trading. And so the vision was there. It was a great idea, but it was the culture that he brought over that ended up being like a virus and was very hostile for all employees and everyone involved working under him. He actually had a process there called the PRC, or Performance Review Committee, to where once a year, all of the employees had to be evaluated. And so with this evaluation process, they got voted between a 1 to a 5. And if you were a 5, you were supposed to be fired by the end of the year because you just weren't good enough. You weren't cutting it for what Skilling thought was the status quo of excellence for the company. And so the other issue with this was 10% of the workforce under his control, I guess we want to call it, they had to be a 5. So essentially, every year, 10% of the workforce at Enron had to be fired because they weren't up to the excellence that he felt they needed. And so this kind of translates to the other side of things of the guys that he hired. He felt like people with spikes had to be hired. And so essentially what that means is they had to be really, really smart. It didn't matter if they had a broad understanding of an industry or lots of experience. They could just be a perfectionist at one item, and they were perfect for the job, and they could do anything. And so most of the people hired were from Ivy League schools. A lot of Harvard MBA students were hired under and worked under Skilling. And so an example of this, he was not necessarily hired by Skilling. He actually worked more closely with Skilling, but it was Lou Pai. And Lou Pai was an excellent trader. He was a genius and a financial derivative guru. He made the company millions of dollars. But he was appointed to the CEO of their wholesale or trading business. But he was just a trader. He was more of an introvert, and he didn't really have much leadership skills. And this was really what the mantra of Enron was. If you're smart enough, you can do anything in the company, whether it be CEO or just be a trader. You had to just be really smart, and everything would just work out fine. And so it ended up obviously not working out okay with having this mantra, because there's a lot of people in this upper leadership and upper management to where they were not qualified for those positions, but they were thought to have had spikes and to be geniuses and that everything would be okay. And so this translates into Enron Energy Services. And I'll go ahead and play an ad for you that kind of gives you an idea of what this is.
What volume from 135?
135. Enron Online will change the markets for many, many commodities. It is creating an open, transparent marketplace that replaces the dark, blind system that existed. It is real simple. You turn on your computer, and it's right there. And if you want to do business, you push the button.
Okay. So Enron Energy Services they were the traders. They saw that the market was deregulated. And so if it's deregulated, they're going to want to trade the commodity and essentially it's like trading stock, make a profit off from it. So to put it bluntly, the traders were known as being savages, essentially. They had a cult mentality, and they were willing to run over everyone and anything to make a profit. One trader is actually quoted saying once that, this is talking about his fellow trader next to him, that if it meant that he had to step on someone else's throat in order to make the profits he needed to, he would do it in a heartbeat. And that meant from the person sitting next to him all the way through to upper management, they were willing to run over everyone and anything in order to make a profit on these markets. And so they had the utmost confidence that they could trade anything. They traded electricity, coal, paper, steel, natural gas, broadband, and at some points they were even trading the weather. And I think trading was kind of a loose word used just because it was used in the business setting, but essentially they had Enron's very, very deep pockets to gamble and essentially day trade on everything. And they lost a lot of money. They hit on some things, they lost a lot of money. And so the idea of this essential trading floor was Enron was an oil company. They signed these, or natural gas rather. They were signing these 10-year contracts where it's supposed to be very, very conservative. And a normal thing to do to mitigate these long-term contrast risks is to set up financial derivatives to mitigate the risk. So that was their purpose, was they were supposed to set up hedges to mitigate the risk of these long-term contracts. But it just got to a point where it got out of hand and they became day traders they're essentially like an investment bank to where they were making these outrageous investments on all sorts of things, but they were trading on the New York Stock Exchange as a commodity service. And so one thing they did put out, I just saw an advertisement for there, is they created Enron Online. Enron Online was available to everyone. And what it really meant was, because everyone had access to it, it was Enron software. But Enron wasn't a software company. They were a trading company. But like I mentioned earlier, they were actually being advertised as a commodity company. So everyone felt it was safe to use Enron Online, but really they had the inside scoop to the entire industry, because all trades and all transactions had to go through them first. And so they had the upper edge to understanding the markets and really having insider knowledge as to what was going on. And so to kind of give an example of the culture that was around the traders, is especially in the early days, Lou Pai, who we mentioned earlier, he at one point, he had an obsession with, after every day after work, he would go to a strip club. And so it got to a point to where the strippers didn't believe that he was actually the CEO of Enron, of a division of Enron. So he brought up the entire club during the middle of the workday one time and essentially had a performance put on the trading floor on a workday to prove to them, and I guess really prove to the traders just how cool they all were. And so that's the mantra of kind of what the traders were, the culture that they set, and the status quo that they set. And so the next item to move on to would be California. And so the traders were doing well. I mean, they were making a lot of money with these different hedges and stuff. It got radical at times, but they were making a little bit of money. But Enron had these astronomical goals of, like, they had to reach 20% growth every quarter. And you had to hit these astronomical numbers every time to get there. And the traders were asking, like, how are we hitting these numbers every time? Well, the answer to that was California. And so this goes back to Ken Lay having this idea, and even Skilling had the idea of, if there's a deregulated market, Enron will be able to capitalize in it every time. So they lobbied hard enough for all these states to deregulate electricity, to have enough competition, bring the prices down. There's no need for the government to have these caps, these floors or ceilings. And so they lobbied hard enough to where California finally decided, like, you know what, you might be right. We're going to go ahead and deregulate our electricity for the state. And so Enron jumped on it right away, and they acquired a company called Portland General. And so they acquired Portland General because they needed closer access to the California power grids. And so then came Tim Belden, who was a trader for Portland General. And he created what the traders themselves called Operation Fat Boy and Death Star. And they are exactly as they sound. Pretty much what they did was, there was capacity, an oil capacity that had been very stable for many years in California. And so normally electricity is going to trade for like $30, $40 or so. And Enron's not going to make much of a profit from that. And they're in it for the profit. They're in it to make money. And so what they did was they exported all of the electricity out, essentially sold it to different power grids outside of California, drove the price all the way up to about $1,000, if not more, instead of $30. like per capita, I guess, of electricity. It was expensive enough they'd sell it back to the utility companies, and utility companies needed to provide electricity for all the homes. That's what their essential service is. And it got to a point where it bankrupt these utility companies. They couldn't afford to provide all this electricity. And so what it resulted in were rolling blackouts for all of California. And it got to a point where the state had to come in. They had to start spending money just to have electricity put into these homes. And it didn't make any sense because California had never had any issues prior to this deregulation of electricity. No one could figure out what the issue was. But it also happened to be that there was convenience that the traders would actually call the power supply facilities, these power plants, and say, hey, like, is it possible that you could be down for about an hour or so for maintenance? And it happened to be that they got enough of these power facilities to be down for maintenance, and drove demand up even higher because there was less capacity coming out of these power plants within California, to where it drove the price up even higher. And so it got to a point where California had to declare a state of emergency because they couldn't get control of the prices of this electricity. Enron had fluctuated so much that it was completely overvalued. And so California reached out for federal support to come in and try and get a hold of this. But conveniently enough, the Bush administration was the federal support, because President George W. Bush was currently president at the time when this was going on. And as his dad called Ken Lay, he called him nicknamed Kenny Boy. And so they were buddies with Ken Lay and really Enron. And so Enron told them, no, like, don't do anything. This is the natural market. This is the way it's going to flow. If you want a deregulated government, or rather a deregulated industry, the government cannot step in. And so, of course, since they were buddies, they didn't step in. California ended up resulting in losing about $40 billion, $30 to $40 billion from all this. And so the way Enron was making money off from it wasn't necessarily because of the outages and the demand for it and stuff, is they were putting hedges on the power that they had control over, that the value of the power would go up. Well, of course, when they first put these hedges in, the power is worth $30, $40. But when you get to the point to where they were able to drive the price up themselves, manipulating it up to over $1,000, they were making hundreds of millions of dollars in gains from these hedges. And of course, in the Enron fashion, these gains should not have been put into operating income, but they put these gains as normal operating income, which showed great earnings for their reports, and it made them hit their numbers every quarter and show the growth rates that Wall Street wanted to see. And so California actually really saved Enron and really fed the fire essentially into their growth and the growth of the company and their stock rates, and really fluffed up their income statement a little bit. So to continue on, let's talk about Andy Fastow. Andy Fastow was the CFO of Enron, and he was the orchestrator and the architect of these financial derivatives, or rather the financial structures and the vehicles to take all this debt and all these losses that they did have and get them off of Enron's books. And so Andy was actually known as not having much of a moral compass, which made him the perfect man for the job under Jeff Skilling, because they needed someone who had a little bit of an edge and was willing to push the line a little bit on the gray area of the GAAP rules as to get this debt off the Enron's books. So what he did is he created, with his other subordinates, SPE. So this Investopedia kind of gets a high-level understanding of what SPE are. I'll get into more detail what Enron specifically did, but essentially is like you have the company and you have this vehicle or this financial structure that's off from it that is like it's like a cargo ship to where you can offload all the bad goods and keep them offshore, off of your books for a time being. And then you have the lenders who supply capital into these cargo ships, if you want to call it, to buy the goods off from onshore and move them off. And so essentially it was a way to keep the bad debt losses off of Enron's books and into this temporary vehicle for time being. So that way they weren't on the statements conveniently at the time of the quarter closes, and they could show earnings and a high growth rate. So it's just better understood when you actually apply it to Enron. So pretty much what they did is they had four main SPEs. They had Jedi, Chuko, Raptor, and LJM. So Jedi, Chuko, and Raptor were more based around Enron. LJM was actually a little bit more associated with Andy himself. So what they did was they had all these horrible contracts that were losing hundreds of millions of dollars, huge liabilities, and tons of losses that would absolutely ruin their earnings report. They had to get them off their books. So they hired Andy to say, hey, we need you to get all this stuff off of our books. So what he did is he set up these funds, and what you can do, or at least what you could do at the time, was if you had an outside party with at least 3% ownership, that 3% ownership could actually be declared controlling ownership. And so the other 97%, which was Enron, could actually declare as non-controlling interest, and they didn't have to consolidate that debt. So what they would do is they created the entities such as Raptor, and they would go to the lenders, all these different investment banks such as JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs and stuff, and they would invest money into these entities knowing that Enron was the inside scoop. And then it turned into what they tried to declare as an arm's length deal, but really it was a 97% Enron making the deal with Enron itself to buy all these bad assets, this debt and stuff, and move it off their books and onto this temporary vehicle. And so this vehicle now had tons of debt, but from the cash that they raised from these lenders through the vehicle, they then moved it over to Enron. So essentially what the transaction ended up being was Enron moved all this debt over, all these expenses over. They raised capital because these SPEs supplied cash to Enron to pay for these. And then conveniently enough, when the quarter passed and they were in the middle of another quarter again, they would sell these bad assets, all this debt, back to Enron again for a huge gain, for a value that was way over what it was. And so that's where LJM came in. And that's where Andy Fastow made about over $20 million from these transactions. Is he was doing deals with himself. He was raising capital, buying these bad assets with LJM, this private equity fund. And when they weren't needed anymore, he'd sell them back to Enron again, or essentially himself, for a way overpriced amount. And it resulted in large gains and him making a lot of money. But at the time, it was actually unbeknownst to Skilling and Lay, although that they didn't know the specific amounts. They just didn't want to know, because Enron was having great earnings, great growth. More investors were coming in, more buying their stock, and they were getting huge bonuses because it kept hitting their growth numbers. The issue they ran into, though, is the lenders did supply capital for these SPEs, but if you take out all this capital, it's got to be backed by something. And so what they did was they backed the SPE's capital, like these loans they took out, with Enron stock, figuring because Enron was perfect. Enron was the best company in the world. There's no way their stock could actually ever fall. So they backed all the loans with this Enron stock. And that's what really created the very high house of cards of, if everything went perfectly and everything was in balance, it worked fine. But if any sort of slip happens, such as their stock price falling, the entire house would fall down, because they would default on their loans. They wouldn't be able to pay them back because the stock wouldn't be able to pay it back. It would be worthless. And so essentially what some people called it, what Andy created, these very, very, very complex financial derivatives, or rather financial structures, it was black magic, because it deceived everyone. And so it worked for a few years. And so it actually transitions to Enron International. So Enron International actually is not talked about much. It was very successful, and there were a lot of big projects in the early 1990s. But it was successful not because they were successful agreements and deals. It was successful because of mark-to-market accounting. And so mark-to-market accounting was actually granted to Enron by both Arthur Andersen and the SEC back in the early 1990s, because they were a commodities company. They were signing these long-term contracts, and these contracts were very conservative. They were just supplying power for these different industries. And so there's no reason for why they were to be allowed to book these profits ahead of time, because nothing would really change. And so Enron took this and absolutely ran with it and abused it. And so what they did was they wanted to expand internationally. So it started by John Wing. They started a energy power plant in England, and it was successful. And they booked it. It was like, it cost them like hundreds of millions of dollars. And so they projected the profits for it would be like $1.3 billion. And so over the course of the life of the plan. And so they book all the profits at one quarter. And so, of course, it showed huge growth ratings, huge profits, and it worked great for their stock, which is all they cared about. So eventually, Rebecca Mark actually ended up taking over this, and she was a CEO of Enron International. And she went into two very high-risk details that, or deals rather, that really caught up with the company down the road. The first was the Brazilian pipeline. They were going to build a pipeline through Central America all the way through down to Brazil, which was a very, very difficult task to do. It was going to cost over $1 billion, a lot of money. But of course, if they used mark-to-market accounting, once they came to agreement with the Brazilian government, they were able to book over $1 billion in operating profits. And again, during that period of time, I was able to show huge growth and more value under Enron, even though there's no actual cash or actual performance being taken on. The other one that was even worse than the Brazil deal was the India deal, which was to build a energy facility in India. And India had always been very regulated by the government, and they didn't have enough money essentially because no one wanted to touch the project. They knew India wouldn't be able to pay them back. But of course, Enron only cared about mark-to-market accounting, and if they just got pen to paper and signed an agreement, they would be able to book billions of dollars in profit because it's projected revenue they might have down the road. And so because of this, the deal ended up being it fell through the floor. I mean, as everyone projected, India was not able to pay Enron back for all these. They ran into a ton of roadblocks, and the company essentially ended up losing hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe even billions of dollars on both these projects. And the only reason why they agreed to them was because of mark-to-market accounting. And it was the mindset that Enron had and their upper leadership had of we just want short-term gains and profits to raise your stock price. And they had no vision at all of their long-term plans as to what would actually happen with all of these. And so, like we mentioned earlier with Andy's SPEs, they were able to move all this debt that they had accumulated that should have been on their consolidated statements, because Enron International was a subsidiary of Enron Corp. And so they just considered it off their books, and they didn't have to consolidate those numbers over. And so all it showed was the huge profits they were projected to have with mark-to-market accounting, but left off huge liabilities and loss they were showing for trying to get these projects to get developed. And so it was very deceiving to Wall Street and the investors. And so what ended up happening with Rebecca, she was actually in line to maybe be the CEO of the company. But she was in line to be the CEO of the company, but it came between her and Skilling. And so Lay had a choice to make as to whether he wanted to go with Rebecca's very long-term and fixed asset strategy, or whether he wanted to go with Skilling's very short-term day trading vision of where he wanted the company to go. Ultimately, he ended up going with Skilling because Skilling mentioned that if Mark gets the CEO position when Lay steps down, then he was going to quit, and Lay knew he needed Skilling. He needed Skilling to be there to run the company and keep that vision that he had to keep it going. So they ended up deferring Mark over. She had to resign as CEO of Enron International, and they told her that Enron wanted to get into water. And so they assigned her to Azurix, which was a company that was set up to fail, because she was to start up Azurix, which was a subsidiary of Enron, but Enron was to supply no resources to Azurix, and Mark had to raise all of her own capital and start it all up. If it's successful, then Enron's going to reap the benefits. And if it failed, it had no implications on Enron at all. And so, of course, Enron knew nothing about the water industry, and it was a complete and utter fail. And that was the end of Mark and her run with Enron. But this is the other crossroad to think that analyzers of Enron, to see what happened to them, would have thought, what if Lay would have gone with Mark instead of Skilling as the visionary of Enron's long run? So this transitions into Enron Broadband Services. So I want to go ahead and show you an advertisement for the Enron Broadband Services.
From 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., we're paying for bandwidth that we are not using.
Why?
Why? We're paying for something we're not using?
Why do we accept things the way they are? If we have a problem, other people do too. There's our market.
Why can't we sell the bandwidth to other companies?
Make it a commodity, like a pork belly.
Okay, so, oops, go back. Okay, so Enron Broadband Services, or EBS. So this was the third major service line, or even subsidiary, if you want to call it that, underneath Enron. And so this was the point to where Enron was the leader and the innovator of the industry. It's like, as they mentioned in their commercials, they want to ask why, and they were the world innovators. They were the greatest company in the world. And so this is during the dot-com boom. They saw all these other dot-com companies just boosting in this bull market. And so they didn't want to be felt like they were left out of all of that. And so they decided that they wanted to get into the cyberspace of things. And so then they created Enron Broadband Services, and they called it Enron Broadband Services because they figured that Wall Street likes the name broadband and it sounded catchy. And so they decided to call it that. And so essentially it was, as the commercial was advertising, they did trade broadband, but that wasn't necessarily their main service line in their approach of what they wanted out of it. Their big deal was with Blockbuster. And so this is like Blockbuster Video. The video stores that used to be around, you could go into them, you could rent movies, and they're now have since gone out of business, but they're really big in the 90s and in the early 2000s even. And so Blockbuster and Enron actually came up with this deal that Enron had the technology to stream movies and TV shows, possibly, into a individual's home. And so as like, if you were to think about today, it's like Netflix or like any other streaming service that's around, but this was groundbreaking technology that no one had ever seen before at the time. And so Enron gave an earnings report and told investors about this new technology that they claimed to have, this huge deal they had with Blockbuster. And so it drove the stock price even higher, and all that, because it was huge potential for Enron, it's going to be groundbreaking technology. Well, as it turns out, that Enron did not have the technology. It wasn't even close to it. They tried doing a dry run, some sample markets, but it ended up only being like 300 homes or so in the entire U.S. because it was a very abstract service that they had to have in order for it to work. And it didn't even work for those 300 customers that had it, or they just didn't use it at all. So it was an absolute failure. It lost hundreds of millions of dollars, like all their other service lines. And so this was the point to where they went over to Andy and they asked him to create another SPE. They moved all of those losses, all that debt off the books. And that's when the executives realized, we have run out of ideas and we need to start selling our shares while they're high. Like the other dot-com boomers, the CEOs and executives essentially pumped and dumped their stock to where when it was really high and they knew the company was probably going to go under, they sold it all before the investors knew what was happening. But it was hard to prove for them because it crashed so fast into the bear market of the early 2000s from the dot-com bubble burst that they couldn't essentially get proven guilty. So of course the executives saw this and they thought, okay, this is it for Enron. We're not sure what the going concern is going to be for the company in the long run. So they began unloading millions and millions of dollars of shares and began cashing them out, of course, without telling any sort of investors or telling their own employees, in which they were highly encouraging to put forth essentially their entire 401k into Enron stock because it was a conservative bet. You worked for the company, you knew it was the best company in the world, and there was no reason not to put all of your 401k or your college savings into Enron stock. And so, I mean, spinning off a little bit, by dumb funding their 401ks and stuff just led to more stock being bought, more bonuses being provided for the top executives, and led to just absolutely lavish lifestyles for all the executives at the employees' expense. And the employees were never given the chance or this insider information to say like, hey, we need to start unloading our shares as well. So this translates into the analysis and creditors. They were just as deceived as really anyone else. They were supposed to be the ones that just tear up the financial statements, dig into them, and figure, why is Enron so successful? What is going on? And so one analysis actually called Enron a black box because they were successful. They had growth coming out. They had earnings coming out. They were making investors money. Stock price kept going up, and it was just a black box. No one knew what was inside of it. They just kind of output good things, which in today's age is horrible. It's illegal. It's not allowed. But at the time then, it was just kind of it was what it was. Skilling and Lay said everything was fine. So the analysis creditors were like, threw up their shoulders and said, okay, everything's fine. And Skilling actually took being called a black box as a compliment and said, yeah, like our financial structures, our trading business is too complicated for anyone to ever understand. There's no reason for anyone to try and understand it. We keep making money and our stock keeps going up, so why ask questions? And so this resulted in the analysis and creditors to keep giving Enron a buy rating. They told it was a conservative buy. It was like investing in any other commodity industry. Unbeknownst to them, they were actually a investment company, essentially. And so it led into all the bankers, even when being based around these SPEs, having investment banking FOMO, as I like to call it. When Andy set up all of these SPEs, he of course needed capital raise. And so he took out loans from all these investment banks and gave them their pitch. And so he went for all the big ones, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, all the above, JP Morgan Chase. And so when all those banks were putting in at least even at a minimum $20 million into each SPE, the other banks didn't want to feel like they couldn't afford to put money into these SPEs, into these entities. And they knew they were affiliated with Enron, who was the pinnacle company to work with. Enron would actually rank the investment banks on a 3-tier scale. And if you were a friend of Enron, you were tier 1, which all the banks wanted to be. And if you're at the bottom of the scale, you were tier 3, and Enron wanted to do business with you. So they all wanted to be tier 1 in Enron's eyes too. So Enron had pretty much everyone on a string to do whatever they wanted to do. And so they had FOMO of they didn't want to be not a tier 1 company and a friend of Enron. And so anytime Enron asked for a loan or needed anything, they had FOMO. They had a fear of missing out of, if we don't put in at least $20 million or whatever everyone else is putting in, they're all doing it. So we should do it too. Like, we need to put in all this capital. And so they fell for all of Enron's scandals as well. And so there was actually one analysis who down-talked Enron one time, the late 1990s, when they were still at the peak of their scandals going on. It was still in the bull market too. So there's no reason for their stock to be in question. And so they down-talked them this question, like, are they really a buy? And all they're putting out is their earnings statement. Like, we haven't seen anything else. Well, Enron later brought it up with the CEO of that investment bank, and that analysis. He was later removed and fired from the company for down-talking Enron stock. So there came harsh repercussions for even questioning whether Enron stock would even be questioned as being a buy rating, or further credit to be an above investment grade rating. And so there was actually one major scandal under Merrill Lynch and an investor from there with the Nigeria barge scandal. So what ended up happening was Enron made another one of their questionable agreements to invest in a Nigerian barge. It's essentially like a power plant on a barge. And it was losing hundreds of millions of dollars. And so it came close to the end of the quarter, and they couldn't have this sitting on their books. They had to hit their earnings and growth numbers for the year. And so because of this, they reached out to a friend from Merrill Lynch. And so they asked this friend, be like, hey, could you guys maybe buy this from us so we can get it off our books and we can record maybe a gain on the sale and show cash flow. And then once the quarter passes by, we'll just buy it back from you and almost pretend like it never happened. And so they claimed that when it was being investigated in court, the Merrill Lynch investor was saying that there was no guarantee. It really was an arm's length deal that was being transacted. But in reality, there was a guarantee set in place, and it was fraud. There's no reason for an investment company in New York City to be investing in a Nigerian barge, a power plant out in the middle of the sea. And so if he eventually got caught, and he ended up getting put away into prison for this fraud, because there was a guarantee set in place to where Merrill Lynch would buy it off Enron's books, Enron would have it off their books for the quarterly statement, and there was a guarantee that Enron would buy it back from them again and have it on their books as if nothing had ever happened. And so there actually was one stint towards the end during the fall of Enron in which Jeff Skilling was on the phone with Analysis during the earnings call, and this is when the bear market was starting to set in. And Analysis were starting to ask a little more questions as like why things were going on, because they saw all those tech companies fall. And so naturally, they had just more of a skeptical mindset of like what's going on. And so a short analysis, or someone who's going to bet against the market, predicting that Enron stock will actually go down, began asking questions that Jeff Skilling didn't like. And Jeff Skilling at the time was actually now the CEO, and Ken Lay was out of the picture a little more. He was more of just the face of Enron. So Jeff Skilling was running the show. So they're on the earnings call, and Enron was barely skating by trying to hit their earnings. And so they shorter, if you want to call them that, asked him like, hey, how come you're the only financial institution out there that's not able to provide a balance sheet, a financial, or rather a statement of cash flow? Every other institution is able to provide us this. How come you guys can't ever provide us a balance sheet? All we ever see is the earnings report. And so Skilling kind of puddled around the question a little bit, kind of like hemmed and hummed, and then paused for a second and proceeded to call him an asshole. Well, that just kind of threw Wall Street and all the analysis in a tailspin. And really, that was the catalyst and the instigator of what blew Enron up. Jeff Skilling had lost control. He was losing his mind. He was barely holding on to grips of trying to skate around, showing these earnings and this growth from year after year, quarter after quarter, that was starting to wear on him a little bit. And so it got to a point to where we get to the fall of Enron. So at this point, Lay's out of the picture. Skilling has been CEO for a couple months now. He called in Analysis and asshole. And so the company's in a tailspin. And so Skilling decides after a few months, he can't do this anymore. He's going to resign as CEO for personal reasons. And so the PR department tried to convince him to not do so because Enron was already in question a little bit as to what was going on. There was an article being put out who was actually, the person who wrote this article was actually the same author of this book that pretty much said, how is Enron making money? There was no proof of anything of where this money was coming from. They just kept showing earnings and growth. And so there's a lot more questions being asked around all this. So Skilling decided to leave for personal reasons. And this is when the tailspin started coming into effect. There was a point when Skilling was actually sitting in his office before he was about to resign. And he made a comment, as we mentioned earlier, the traders were kind of like a cult and a bunch of savages. And so he described the traders as being inmates who had taken over the asylum, because they were all coming for the executives' heads also, because they saw all these hundreds of millions of dollars being paid in bonuses, and they were still getting paid a lot of money from bonuses, but they wanted their cut. They wanted to be the top of the line also, and they were running wild on the trading floor. So they lost control of the traders. Skilling lost control. Lay never really had control. And so that's what led to even more of an issue, because Skilling left and Lay took over as CEO at this point. And so now Lay, who hadn't run operations really ever at Enron, he was just a political figure and just the face of the company, was now running the operations because Skilling had departed. And so this is when Sharon Watkins comes in. So Sharon Watkins was a fixed asset analyzer. She was in accounting for Enron for a while, and she realized when looking through the books that Enron's stock was falling, and there were these debt covenants that were coming up that Enron was coming close to, that if they fell below, I believe it was $30 per share on their stock, which they're coming close to, and if they had a below investment grade credit rating, that they would not meet their debt covenants. They would have like 7 days to pay off these hundreds of millions of debt that they had accumulated in these SPEs, because Enron was still responsible for the debt within those SPEs that they had backed with their Enron stock. So she realized that Enron was about to default on like over $1 billion in debt that they had to pay in cash to these lenders, which they didn't have. So she felt like she needed to tell Ken Lay about this. So she wrote an anonymous letter to him, the letter that I think we've all maybe seen before, letting him know that like, hey, essentially whistleblowing. She did it anonymously, to begin with, letting him know like, hey, Enron's about to default on all these loans. We need to do something. Like, we need to take some sort of action. Otherwise, Enron's going to go under from all this stuff. And she looked more into it, and she realized that all of this capital raise is all just fraud. And she's like, from my experience, seeing this sort of stuff, you either go under, or the only way to survive is you just try and fix it and come out clean and apologize. So finally, Ken Lay saw all this, and this goes back to even the scandal in the 1980s. He had an idea all this stuff was going on, but never wanted to know the details. So he, like before, turned his head away and was like, well, like, everything's gonna be okay. It's just a lot of really bad PR going on right now. It'll all blow over. Everything will be kind of okay again. His mantra was, everything will just be okay. We're Enron. We're perfect. We're powerful. We're strong. Everything will just be okay. So eventually, Watkins got frustrated enough to where she showed her identity, really fought it hard, and was an internal whistleblower. She never went to the SEC. She never went to any other outside parties, but she was an internal whistleblower to upper management to say, hey, there's this going on. We have all this fraud. We have all these SPEs. And she disclosed Fastow's LJM SPEs and private equity funds that he was cashing in $20 million from, in which Lay and Skilling didn't even know about. And so then this is when everything fell through, and Enron stock proceeded to keep on declining and falling down. People were losing faith in the company. Lay couldn't get a hold of things. He was actually quoted once as saying, too, of people asked how his family was doing, how they're holding up financially. And Lay just shook his head and said, our family used to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars now. And our net worth now is just $20 million, which was a huge just insult to all the employees, especially when things did hit ground bottom, because he was claiming that their net worth was still tens of millions of dollars when all their employees had invested all of their life savings, their 401k, their college funds, all into Enron stock, and it was plummeting out of control. So Ken Lay figured the only way maybe to get out of this mess was to set up an acquisition. And so we set up with a company called Dynegy, which is also a Houston-based company, was really like the little brother to Enron through all the years. The Dynegy at first was shocked that Enron actually approached them and was like, hey, do you want to acquire us? Like, we're in a tailspin. Like, at least salvage something from what we had. And so what it ended up being was they had everything set in place, about to go through. The creditors were actually about to rate Enron as a below investment grade rating, which meant that they defaulted on all their loans and they owed however many hundreds of millions of dollars back to the banks within like a couple days, 7 days or so. But they had no cash. And so they would just be inevitable bankruptcy. Figured this was their only hope, was just to sell the company through an acquisition to Dynegy. And so, of course, Enron was not 100% transparent because they were the black box of their transparency. And so they did not disclose everything to Dynegy, especially all the debt that they actually really had. And so what ended up resulting in was, through time, more and more information kept trickling into Dynegy that there was more and more baggage coming with this acquisition than maybe even they thought. They thought Enron was super successful, but the more and more they were finding out was there was a huge mess that they had to deal with. The traders actually at one point tried to revolt up against the Dynegy staff and try to essentially take over their business themselves on their own. And so Dynegy didn't want anything to do with them. And so essentially, long story short, the acquisition fell through and Enron stock fell below $1 and they had to file for bankruptcy. And as the book closed it out, one of the executive members that flew up with Lay up to New York for their bankruptcy hearing, they loaded up into their multi-million-dollar private jet and they stayed at a 5-star hotel when all on Enron's dime, when they had no money left and they were flying for bankruptcy. And he stated that they should have flown Southwest Airlines and stayed at the Ramada Inn instead for the position that they were in. And after that, that was the end of Enron. And as far as punishment goes for Lay and Pai and Skilling and Fastow actually confessed first. He worked with the federal agents and he reduced his sentence to about 10 years or so. And he gave up pretty much all of Enron's secrets and all of his financial structures. And it really gave the feds a lot of insight as to what happened to make sure it wouldn't happen again, and also to put the pin on Skilling and Lay. So Skilling and Lay were actually tried together. And during the trial, Skilling actually held his composure very well, and he denied everything. They had already acquitted most of the Enron executives. They knew the entire story. The judge knew the entire story. The press did. The jury did. But they still gave a fair trial for Skilling and Lay together. And they pretty much denied anything that they knew anything. They pointed their fingers at the analysis, the creditors, Arthur Andersen, and that they were misled and had no idea what Fasto was doing with the SPEs and his LJM private equity fund. They had no idea he made $20 million from these non-arm's length business transactions. And so, in short, Skilling's sentence was actually set to 20 years in prison and owed a ton of money in fines too. Almost his entire net worth had to be given away in fines. So he had served 20 years, but Lay actually lost his cool during the trial. And it was projected that Skilling would get a worse punishment than Lay would have, because Lay was just the face of the company. He had no idea what the operations were and could have played it off that way. But he lost his cool during the trial, and the jury felt like he was even more guilty than even Skilling was. And so Lay got sentenced to 40 years in prison. So after he was acquitted, and they were outside the courtroom, he was consoling with his family and such. And so in the Ken Lay fashion, reporters camped him, and he felt like he had to give a press statement of how he felt. And he said, God has a plan for me, and everything will be okay. Like, God has a plan, and everything will be all right. Well, as it turns out, 5 months later, Ken Lay actually died of a heart attack before even serving any time in prison. And so I guess to put a long story short, maybe he did have a plan in store for him. And some people were frustrated that he ended up serving no time behind bars. But the feds did try and come after, or rather not the feds, but more people tried to sue to try to get his estate, because he still had hundreds of millions of dollars in that estate for his family that he made from Enron. But I do not believe anything came of it. And so next I want to talk about, just because it wasn't mentioned as much in the book, they're more of a role character, but I think this more pertains to our class, considering that we are all accountants. But the story of Arthur Andersen and their role in all this. So Arthur Andersen's motto is think straight, talk straight. And so that was a motto that was set in the early days of Arthur Andersen. It was started in Chicago. It was the only just like prideful US-based public accounting firm. They were known as the best of the best. And so that was their motto really all the way through up till their end. But that motto did not hold true up to like the late 90s when all this stuff was taking place. So Arthur Andersen was actually already under investigation for a different scandal that had taken place earlier. So they're already on thin ice, the SEC. If they had one more slip up, it probably would have been the end for them. So they were trying to be pretty conservative as to what was going on. And so Arthur Andersen's biggest client was Enron, and that was their baby. I believe Arthur Andersen was billing Enron about $1 million every week for their services. And essentially what Arthur Andersen did was Fasto and the other accountants would show what these structures were and what they were doing. And Arthur Andersen was just the yes man sitting there saying, yeah, okay, that sounds okay, because they essentially were doing nothing illegal accounting based. It was just a gray area within the accounting rules under GAAP. As the book called it, they were having a dog turn into a duck, just because I think it was, if you have a dog and that's the accounting rules, that's GAAP. Well, just because you put a beak on it and some flippers on it, does that make it a duck at that point? And so that's what they were seeing it as was, yeah, it's still a dog, but you can interpret it as a duck also. And so that's the example behind it was there was a lot of gray area in these rules in GAAP to where Arthur Andersen couldn't necessarily say no to these individual transactions, when you put them all together, it's obviously a fraud scheme. They should have never agreed to it. So it got to a point to where things were starting to fall and the stock price starting to plummet for Enron. And a lawyer for Arthur Andersen actually told a partner for Arthur Andersen to say, like, hey, like, things are probably going to go down here pretty soon. You guys need to get rid of those work papers. If you get caught those work papers for Enron after all those years, those transactions, Arthur Andersen will go down. So they spent an entire weekend in the break room just down the street from Enron at the Arthur Andersen building, shredding over a ton of Enron work papers. And they kept shredding. They probably would have shredded everything they could have, but it got to a point when the SEC sent them a subpoena stating that they were under investigation and that the SEC essentially had the right to confiscate anything. So then at that point, they kept their hands off and let things play out. So Arthur Andersen actually ended up being found not guilty under trial. They were able to escape away from that, but they were caught up so much into the scandal that their name was right next to Enron for all these schemes that their reputation was shot. And they lost all the clients, they couldn't keep partners around, they couldn't keep their clients. And so essentially it was their reputation, or the lack of reputation now, that drove the company down into being nothing. They had to essentially go under. So really what brought from all of this, though, was we had the creation of SOX. And so really what SOX is it took a mold of everything that happened at Enron and everything Arthur Andersen did wrong and everything that Enron did wrong that was not transparent to the shareholders, that limited the control the executives had, especially to capital within the company, and also the transparency and the independence required of these auditors. Is what SOX brought to the accounting industry. And it really led to the largest reform in accounting, most likely in our lifetime. I hope in our lifetime at least. And so that's really, long story short, what this entire Enron scandal brought to our industry and what we are going to have to deal with now. And so, yeah, and that is the story of Enron and Arthur Andersen. And then here are the sources and a perfect way to, I guess, close out of the Ask Why mantra that I showed in all those advertisements. Coming full circle with Mr. Skilling himself of really showing what Enron is going to be perceived as today and really from here on out. So thank you for watching, and please reach out if you have any further questions.